Well, let's talk more about what's been proposed in Strasbourg. Joining me from there, the UKIP leader Nigel Farage, who we saw in that earlier report a few moments ago. Nigel Farage, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You were in the chamber there for what Jean-Claude Juncker had to say, and he talked about the issue being a matter of humanity and human dignity, and put forward this proposal for quotas to 22 EU countries. What do you think?
What I think is this, that from April it was clear that Jean-Claude Juncker was going to implement the EU's common asylum policy. The problem with that policy, as I tried to point out at the time, is that it casts the definition for who qualifies way beyond the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugee Status, and even includes people who come from poor countries. So what we're seeing is this huge tide of humanity coming across the Mediterranean, taking massive risks, being in the hands of the criminal traffickers and ISIS and all the rest of it. And what we're not doing is we're not sorting out who are genuine refugees and who are not. So to ask me to comment on what I think of the Juncker plan to distribute 160,000 people around the rest of Europe, my answer is, why don't we get back to the basics? Why don't we find out who a refugee is, who a refugee isn't? And surely the only way we can stop the drownings and stop the exploitation is to stop the boats coming by having offshore reception centres where we can assess people.
Right, well, let me follow you down that road in that case. How do you define a genuine refugee in this context?
Dead easy. We've been doing it, actually Britain's been doing it for about 350 years, and it's been codified since 1951. A refugee, by definition, is an individual in direct fear themselves of persecution because of their race, religion, ethnicity, or political or social beliefs. That is what a refugee is. And we've known that and understood that. And if you look at the people that have come to Europe over the course of the last year, the vast majority of them would not qualify, with the best will in the world, for being refugees.
Even those fleeing the civil war in Syria?
Well, hang on. Most people who've come to Europe have not come from Syria. And the problem now is because Angela Merkel has really, inflated the original message that came from Jean-Claude Juncker 6 months ago. Now anybody can come to Europe, throw their passport into the Mediterranean and say they've come from Syria. So we're just not getting this right, and we're not sorting out who are the genuine refugees. And by the way, I do believe that Britain and the rest of Europe have a duty to help genuine refugees, but not for us to be an open door to economic migrants.
No, I accept that you've made that point about genuine refugees before. I want to get this idea of these centres that you're talking about, which will sort this all out, which are not in Europe. Where are you going to put them?
Well, what I'm keen to do, number one, is stop people drowning. And you stop people drowning if you tell them that if you come by this route, you will not be accepted. This is exactly what Australia did back in 2008. Now, I'm actually quite pleased that the British government, for once, have not got along with the European line and have said that we will take refugees, but take them directly from the camps. Now, it's perfectly clear there are very big camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Turkey. Interestingly, there are 6 other wealthy Arab states who are refusing to take a single person. So I'd like to see a bit more effort and emphasis put on them. But I do think that David Cameron, for once, has listened to the arguments, and the European Union need, I think, to go along with that model. The problem is, what I heard today from Mr. Juncker in his State of the Union speech is they refuse to accept they've got anything wrong. And I now genuinely believe that my prediction that we will see a flow of people into Europe of biblical proportions will come true.
Can I also put to you what Mr. Juncker said with regards to wider reform? Because he talked about the need for more fundamental change in the way we deal with asylum applications, not, I suspect, necessarily along the lines that you've just outlined, but he made that point. And he said, and notably the Dublin system that requires that asylum applications be dealt with by the first country of entry. Now, what's your response to that specifically?
Yeah, I mean, that was very interesting. I mean, look, since 1951, we've accepted internationally that you claim refugee status in the first safe country you come to. Mr. Juncker wants to ditch that because he doesn't want to actually recognise that Italy and Germany or Britain are different countries. We're all part of the European state with one flag, one anthem, one police force, ultimately one army and one asylum policy. What he also said is he will come back next March or next April, not just with an asylum policy, but with a common EU immigration policy.
Right, but just on that specifically, according to EU figures, since the Dublin rules were agreed 12 years ago, asylum applications in Britain have stabilised, and Britain's share of Europe's asylum claims has declined from about 10% in 2008 to, I think, 5% last year. So, I mean, do you acknowledge those figures for a start?
Well, we are fortunate. There are two very wise things Britain did. One was say no to the euro, thank goodness, and the other was to say no to Schengen. And that's why, you know, now anyone that gets into Greece or Italy or Hungary can freely go to Germany without their details being checked. They can't get to Britain through the same means, which is why you've got the camp at Calais. So, you know, however much we've suffered over the summer, and Kent's businesses have suffered, our problems are as nothing compared to countries like Germany that are stuck in Schengen.
One more, if I may, because you talked about you want to stop the drownings. Everybody wants to stop the drownings. We are where we are. People are prepared to take enormous risks to get across the Mediterranean in appalling conditions. Whatever measures you take longer term are not going to stop the drownings tomorrow. So what will you do in the immediate term to try and arrest this situation?
I'm sorry, I don't agree with the premise of that question. If you look at many of the people, not all, but many of the people that are coming to European territory, they are paying thousands of euros to people smugglers to get across to mainland Europe.
Because they're desperate.
If they knew that on arriving in Kos or in Lampedusa or indeed in Hungary, that they would simply be refused entry, they would not spend that money, and they would not put their lives in the hands of very dangerous criminal gangs and traffickers. And this is exactly what Australia faced back in 2008, and the Australians said, if you come through this route, we guarantee you one thing, you will not be accepted. And that was the way the Australians stopped the drownings, and nobody would call Australia a country that was closed.
Good to have your thoughts. Thank you very much for coming on. The leader of UKIP, a member of the European Parliament, of course, as well, Nigel Farage.